Peter. I'd now like to call our first official speaker. We are honoured to have the Honourable Mr. Phillip Ruddock. Mr. Ruddock is a federal member for Barara, and he's here today representing the Honourable Tony Abbott, the Leader of the Opposition. Now, we all know Mr. Ruddock has had a long history with the Coptic Church. He was privileged to meet our beloved His Holiness Pope Shenouda on 2 occasions previously before, and his association with our church goes back decades. Or before he was an immigration minister, and also when he was an immigration minister under Mr. Howard's leadership. So thank you, Mr. Ruddock, for sparing your time here on a Sunday. Please make Mr. Ruddock feel welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Mona. Can I acknowledge Bishops Daniel and Reverend Fathers and my colleagues? Can I acknowledge particularly Craig Kelly, Chris Bowen, Laurie Ferguson, my many state colleagues that are here today, and your many distinguished guests. I would have been here regardless, but I'm delighted to represent my leader. And I do so in the context of his personal and continuing interest in the plight of the Copts of Egypt. And only several days ago he issued this statement. The Coalition is concerned that Egypt's Copts continue to face great stress. The latest incident on the 7th of April, a funeral at Cairo's St Mark's Coptic Cathedral, 4 Copts killed in sectarian violence, came under attack, resulting in a further death and many injuries. Tragically, he goes on, the collapse of the Mubarak regime has led to increased violence against Egypt's Coptic community. Since then, Copts around the world, including tens of thousands in Australia, have been increasingly anxious about the difficult situation faced by members of their faith in Egypt. He goes on to remind us that he was at the vigil here in Sydney in October. And he says, as I said at the major prayer vigil in Sydney in October 2011, a democracy must be judged not by how it effectively implements the will of the majority, but how effectively it protects the rights of the minority. He goes on to say the Australian government should impress on Egyptian authorities, including through a statement, its concerns about the situation of Egypt's Coptic community, and urge the country's leaders to establish a fully democratic political system which protects the rights of minorities. He concludes by saying, for the Coalition, nothing else is acceptable. If he were here today, he would have heard Peter Tadros speak. And I must say, the catalogue of state-sponsored terrorism emphasised in my mind what I read and understand is happening in Egypt. When I first met the late Pope Shenouda, it was at a time when Egypt had relative peace. But for the Copts of Egypt, it has never been easy. And I know, as I later became Minister for Immigration, how important it was for Australia to be able to help and assist those who were singled out, particularly because of their faith. And when I put in place the humanitarian program, I did so at a time when Copts were far less under pressure than they are now. I think it is appropriate for Australia to respond, and to respond vigorously. And it's not just because of the plight of the Copts. It goes to the very future of Egypt, in my view. And I read in The Economist of the 30th of March a very interesting article suggesting that Egypt will face collapse unless broader based government is able to take tough decisions. And it went on to say, after 30 years of dictatorship, elections brought to power the Muslim Brotherhood, who, although they had suffered some decades of persecution, promised to be inclusive and tolerant. But since the brothers Mohamed Morsi became president at the end of June last year, politics has become steadily nastier. Egyptian society is never more polarised. Protests frequently turn violent. Security forces oscillate between support for the Islamists and the deep suspicion of them. And it goes on to say, unless Morsi takes drastic steps soon, Egypt could crash. Virtually every economic indicator points to trouble. The currency has slid by 10% since January. Unemployment may be as high as 20%. The stock exchange this year slumped a tenth. Tourism, which used to account for 12% of Egypt's GDP, has evaporated. And foreign investment has dried up. I think that tells a very important story. That if Egypt is to have prosperity, if it is able to deliver for all Egyptians, it has to ensure that its minority is effectively protected. And that is the challenge. And I just want to assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that the Liberal Party of Australia, led by Tony Abbott, is very conscious of the need to take leadership on these issues. And it's not to be partisan. It's because the very future of the nation of Egypt is at stake. The Copts should not be singled out in the way in which they have been. And we have to make sure that the world hears our voice on this matter.